Israel's leader heads for the United States, looking for peace with Syria as Washington plays the honest broker.
This is a huge historic opportunity.
The new century, the year 2000 agenda at the White House, the Capitol, the Supreme Court, on Wall Street. And the hope for an end to all this, the killing fields that span the world and the century just ended.
The 20th century was the worst century mankind has ever lived through.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News, reported by John Siegenthaler.
Good evening, everyone. We begin tonight with the latest possibilities for peace in the Middle East. Israeli and Syrian leaders are heading for the U.S. for what could be groundbreaking peace talks. After more than 50 years of conflict, both sides appear to be ready to deal, but the negotiations are just beginning. NBC's Martin Fletcher reports from Tel Aviv. Of course, peace in the Middle East is high on President Clinton's agenda. As the president begins his final year in office, NBC's John Palmer takes a look at what else Mr. Clinton hopes to accomplish.
President Clinton spent a lot of time over the holidays working on the State of the Union message he'll deliver to Congress later this month, laying out his final legislative agenda, his last chance to shape his presidential legacy. Aides say Mr. Clinton has planned an aggressive agenda, a mixture of unfinished business and new initiatives.
We'll have some new and I think interesting ideas about how we can move forward on making our educational system the best in the world, on strengthening and modernizing our schools and rebuilding the schools that are crumbling at this point.
On gun control, the Clinton administration is convinced that Congress has badly underestimated the public's appetite for new regulations. Passing a Patient's Bill of Rights is also a White House priority. 3 years ago, Mr. Clinton designated nearly 2 million acres of federal land in southern Utah as a national monument. This year, with perhaps an eye on an environmental legacy, Mr. Clinton plans to designate 3 additional large tracts of land in Arizona and California as national monuments. With Republicans controlling Congress, many expect the president to concentrate on foreign policy.
Foreign policy is going to be natural because you can't get that much more done domestically, and so that is the one area because you don't have to deal with the Congress and some of the things that you're doing.
The White House has already penciled in another Clinton trip to Northern Ireland as a kind of victory lap for the role the president played in negotiating peace between Catholics and Protestants there. And Mr. Clinton hopes to play a central role this year in diffusing the nuclear standoff between India and Pakistan. The president's biggest hope for legacy remains achieving a comprehensive Middle East peace settlement, bringing together not only the Israelis and Palestinians, but Syria as well. John Palmer, NBC News at the White House.
When NBC Nightly News continues in a moment, what happens on Wall Street when business reopens tomorrow? And later, an ecological battle in Baja California, nature and business with competing priorities. So far, so good with the Y2K bug. Tomorrow begins the business week as 90% of the world's computers go back online. Airlines soar to full capacity when business travelers and late holiday stragglers hit the skies. And world markets will be up to speed on the first official business day of the century. But the year 2000 has a tough act to follow after last year's 25% gain on the Dow and the astounding 85% leap in the NASDAQ. CNBC's Alan Chernoff has more.
There's one question on every investor's mind. Can the stock market keep on climbing? Many market veterans are nervous.
We would, I think, universally agree that this cannot go on, that you're in the 7th, 8th, or 9th inning of the momentum game.
5,000 trades at 13, I'll be done. Truth is, the stock market as a whole isn't as high as it appears. In fact, a majority of the Standard & Poor's 500 stocks declined in 1999. The same is true for nearly half of the NASDAQ stocks. A relatively short list of technology and telecommunications companies powered the gains. On the NASDAQ, for example, the 3 biggest stocks, Microsoft, Cisco Systems, and Intel, account for 21% of the composite index. 3 factors are key to determining how stocks ring in this new year. Interest rates. Economists say they're going higher. That's usually bad for stocks. Corporate profits expected to remain strong, good for stocks, and psychology as important as ever to the market, and so difficult to predict.
If it does switch to the fear side of the equation, greed and fear, then all of a sudden people will change their psychology very quickly, and that could cause a problem in the market. So it's a dangerous market.
Because market psychology is so fickle, investment advisors recommend diversification. Think of stocks as eggs and basketballs. Eggs are unproven internet high flyers that could splatter if they tumble. Basketballs are companies with consistent earnings growth, likely to bounce back from a fall. Market pros say it's okay to own some eggs, but they recommend buying mainly basketballs. Alan Chernoff for NBC News, New York.
The year 2000 will bring Congress a list of priorities, and lawmakers will be facing some battles in the upcoming session. NBC's Joe Johns has a preview.
The challenge for House Speaker Dennis Hastert is monumental. Avoid being labeled as the leader of a do-nothing Congress in an election year, when policy often takes a back seat to politics. Hastert's priorities for House Republicans: final passage of a plan to reform health maintenance organizations, legislation to expand foreign trade, and he wants a tax cut.
Anything going through in a political year such as this could be a problem, but I think those are things that the American people can agree on.
But nothing is certain given the current makeup of the House and the high political stakes. Right now, Republicans hold 222 seats. Democrats hold 212. That means Democrats only need a net gain of just 6 seats in November's election to regain control of the House. Leading the charge, top Democrat Richard Gephardt, who decided against a presidential run to focus on retaking the House.
What I want is a Democratic majority in the Congress so that we can get the issues that we've been talking about here done. That's why I'm in public service, and that's what I want to get done.
Democratic priorities include gun safety legislation, new education initiatives, a new prescription drug program, issues embraced in principle by many Republicans, but the parties often split over the details. Over in the Senate, Republicans have 55 seats and are in firm control. Still, the Democratic leader is trying to keep policy expectations high.
I don't think that election years have to be a legislative no man's land. I think we actually can accomplish something.
Both parties know their legislative agendas could soon be overshadowed by the race for the White House.
The presidential candidates, not congressional leaders, really dictate the themes for the 2000 campaign.
In this political year, many predict the gridlock of 1999 will continue, but they also know the spirit of compromise can suddenly sweep Capitol Hill when members up for re-election are in tight races. Joe Johns, NBC News, the Capitol.
The Supreme Court also has a busy agenda in the months ahead. NBC's Pete Williams has a preview of the court's key cases.
One of the nation's hottest issues, religion at public schools, comes to the Supreme Court with this question. Does it violate the Constitution if schools let students lead prayers at high school football games?
In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
A federal court told a Texas public school district to stop the prayers, a decision supported by groups that monitor the separation of church and state.
Any time that prayers are prayed at an official school event, including a football game, some students are going to feel like second-class citizens on their own football field.
But Texas Governor George Bush is urging the Supreme Court to reverse the ruling. He says students should be free to deliver whatever messages they want in the football stadium, even prayers. From a college campus in Virginia comes a question of federal power over the states. When Christy Broncala of Virginia Tech University reported that 2 football players had violently raped her in her dorm room, school officials at first found against one of the students but then dropped the charges. Outraged, she went to court on her own and sued the athletes, invoking a recently passed federal law, the Violence Against Women Act, that gives victims of sex crimes the right to file lawsuits against their attackers, even if no criminal charges are ever filed. The Supreme Court must decide if lower courts were right when they declared the law unconstitutional. They ruled that Congress improperly stepped on the traditional power of the states to prosecute crimes. But women's groups say that justices should uphold the law, that police often fail to take crimes like rape seriously.
The state justice systems don't treat violence against women in the same way that they treat other similar crimes.
The court will also decide whether grandparents have the right to visit their grandchildren when the parents object. and the fate of one of the nation's best-known police practices, the Miranda warning, advising people arrested of their right to keep quiet to avoid incriminating themselves.
Your money, a wild day of trading on the markets as 2000 begins, as millions of Americans go back to work and their computers go back online. Tonight, the early line on Y2K. And in depth, the cost of preventing Y2K disaster, over $100 billion. Many are asking, was it really necessary? Decision 2000, a major new push for both Gore and Bradley in key states. Plus, guess who's raising the most money? And Lifeline 2000, when every second counts. The most modern ER. Important news for you and your family.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw. Substituting tonight, Brian Williams.
Good evening and Happy New Year. As we come on the air tonight, a lot of people are hoping that 2000 is going to be a lot calmer than this first trading day of the first new year on Wall Street. There was an explosion with the opening bell, and it didn't stop until the close. At the end of this wild session, the Dow ended up down almost 140 points, but the NASDAQ was up almost 62. That's another record close. And now the question is whether or not up and down like this is going to be the shape of things to come in 2000. NBC News Chief Financial Correspondent Mike Jensen starts us off tonight with what could be called Y2 trade. Mike, good evening to you.
Brian, NASDAQ had the most volatile day in its 29-year history, the wildest price swings, and it was one of its busiest days ever in trading volume. Wall Street's first trading day of the new millennium begins with financial fireworks on NASDAQ. The average soaring an astonishing 122 points, a gain of 3% in the first 2 minutes of trading.
A total of $5 million?
Following huge gains on stock markets overseas while Americans sleep. In Europe, Africa, Asia, Singapore shooting up more than 4%. A Y2K relief rally because the Millennium computer bugs never show up.
Everything has gone tickety-boo, so no problem that we can speak of.
No problems because of billions of dollars spent to reprogram computers at places like the New York Stock Exchange, where a small army of technicians works over the weekend. Then, as quickly as today's Y2K relief rally begins, it ends. Investors focusing instead on two big worries.
Today, investors were concerned about rising interest rates.
That's worry number one, that the Fed will raise interest rates when it meets February 1st and 2nd in Washington. Higher rates usually mean lower stock prices. Worry number two, is it time for a Wall Street correction? Stock prices never go up in a straight line, even in bull markets. It's 2 or 3 steps forward and 1 step back. So today, in the middle of the morning, a wave of selling. The Dow tumbling 191 points, NASDAQ down 80, before they recover some of that. Some investors worried, but most, like Tom Brahms, say they'll sit tight.
Just leave everything the way it is and, let it ride for the next 5 or 10 years.
What can average investors expect in the year 2000? We asked Stephen Roach, chief economist at Morgan Stanley Dean Witter.
The year 2000 will be more of a roller coaster ride than we've seen in some time, but the broad averages should be about 10% higher than they were at the end of 1999.
Higher because the U.S. economy is set for another good year. Plenty of jobs, no recession, and a 10% gain for the stock market, according to a lot of analysts. Brian?
Mike Jensen, thank you for that tonight. And now, Y2K-wise, how did things go after all? We're still here, and presumably you're still there. And the dire Y2K predictions seem to go the way to the confetti in Times Square. But did everything out there go as smoothly? We get a roundup tonight from NBC's Robert Hager.
Brian, tonight here at this monitoring center, the government formally declares victory in its battle to prevent Y2K computer problems. This after systems, major and minor, pass one more milestone.
100 million Americans return to work today, millions more back to school. Find lights on and computers humming, from giant corporations to mom-and-pop businesses like the 9 dry cleaning stores David Draymond owns in Maryland.
I called my stores to make sure they had no problems and everything was up and running from the computers on the counter to the actual dry cleaning machines that are computerized.
Same at doctors' offices. California ophthalmologist Stephen Chang.
We expected the worst, prepared for the worst, and we're pleasantly surprised that there is no problem.
As for those schools, despite claims 1/3 are not Y2K ready, no reports of problems today. None. U.S. Y2K czar John Koskinen.
We can safely say that what has been referred to as the Y2K bug has been squashed.
And elsewhere, only minor glitches. At some Godiva chocolate stores in New York, a Y2K problem shuts down cash registers briefly this morning. Computers taking in pictures from U.S. military spy satellites finally fixed today after 2 days of problems. And at a video rental store in upstate New York, computerized scanner believes tapes are returned 100 years overdue. Calculates late fees amounting to tens of thousands of dollars.
If we still, after all that work, have minor glitches, you can imagine what the risks are if we hadn't done the work.
So Americans breathing easier, returning purchases of emergency supplies.
The batteries and the flashlights are about the only thing coming back. The only thing today, we had a cartload of charcoal come back.
Even at that video store, customers taking news of the 100-year late charges in stride.
As of today, if you had a late tape, you're at $91,000 recharge.
Well, that's no problem. Just put it on my account.
With that, the federal government says it's now so confident that after tonight it'll cut back its 24-hour-a-day monitoring year and gradually will come down to a skeleton staff by the week's end. Brian?
Bob Hager with us from Washington tonight. Thank you. So now that the holiday celebrations and all the Y2K and other anxieties have subsided, the time has come when at least some Americans will actually start to sit up and take notice of the fact that there's a presidential campaign going on, and the first big contest is coming up fast. It's later this month. Joining me now from Iowa on how the Democrats' battle is shaping up for their part, NBC News correspondent Claire Shipman. Claire, good evening to you.
Brian, finally it is election year, and the two Democratic candidates are eager to seize the moment. Today, both trying to sound like visionaries, but preparing for a brawl.
Betting that the public is now ready to pay attention, Bill Bradley takes to the stump in New Hampshire today, Al Gore in Iowa, laying out competing visions for the presidency. Bradley, whose strength is among independent voters, casting himself as a new thinker.
Some people say we can never achieve our special destiny. But I say, in a world of new possibilities, guided by goodness, we can and we will.
Gore, who's courting the traditional Democratic vote, describing himself as a fighter.
The presidency is not an academic exercise. It's not a seminar where you get to entertain a single grand theory. The presidency is a long, resolute, day-by-day fight for people.
Subtle swipes today, but look for them to turn brutal soon. The first contest, the Iowa caucuses, is just 3 weeks away. A recent poll shows Gore ahead, 48% to Bradley's 27%. In New Hampshire, with a primary 1 week later, February 1st, the race is much tighter. Bradley's ahead at 42% to Gore's 39%. That's why on a day when Bradley tries to stay above the fray, his team hands out a flyer to reporters, claiming Gore's budget breaks the bank by $350 billion, and why Gore's team snaps back, hitting Bradley's health plan.
Senator Bradley seems to have as much difficulty with our budget numbers as he does with his own health care numbers.
But the more critical money question, who has the funds to get the message out? According to the most recent filing, Bradley is raising money faster than the vice president and is actually outspending Gore on TV ads in Iowa and New Hampshire by more than $1 million.
Bradley needs to hold on to what little edge he may have in New Hampshire. He's got to win New Hampshire. He can't survive a loss.
And in Iowa tonight, the expectations game. Gore is the favorite here, but he knows he has to win by a good margin in order to remain the frontrunner. And Bradley, who's been spending more and more time here, knows he has to come close in order to have momentum heading into New Hampshire. Brian?
Claire Shipman in rainy Iowa tonight. Thank you for that. As for the Republican contenders, look for some news from them tomorrow. That's when ex-candidate Elizabeth Dole will endorse frontrunner George W. Bush on a campaign swing through Iowa and New Hampshire. Dole's reportedly angling for the vice presidential spot. The Bush campaign says no promises have been made. Coming up as we continue, going too far. NBC News in depth. It cost billions to get ready for this new century, but was it all worth it?
I think what we did, in short, was we turned a potential problem into a definite opportunity.
Preparing for Y2K, much ado about nothing, or was it well worth the effort in the end? That's tonight's In Depth. And the new president at the Kremlin. Who is this former top spy who now happens to be running the Russian government? NBC News In Depth tonight. The big fix. For much of last year, it was the talk of the country, and the cost was astronomical. But when all was said and done, some say the Y2K frenzy felt like major overkill. Or was it? NBC's Jim Avila reports tonight. In Depth.
The morning after, and Jacksonville, Florida's Vicki Crosby with a Y2K hangover. A garage full of supplies, from wood stove to freeze-dried potatoes. Everything but regrets.
That was money well spent.
Like most of America, Crosby probably spent too much. But she begins the first week of the new century confident getting ready for Y2K was worth it.
I was elated. The last thing I wanted to do was use a plunger to wash my clothes.
And she can't just return everything. Sears announced a 20% restocking fee. And others like Spitzer in Denver, which sold 900 generators last year, warned Y2Kers all sales are final.
We have a no return policy on them.
And it was not just individuals who overprepared. A new study by International Data Corporation, released today, says American businesses and government spent $122 billion on Y2K retrofit. Worldwide, $280 billion spent, all to make computers understand the new date. IDC chief researcher John Gantz says that's $30 billion too much.
We had to do the work. We just didn't have to work quite as hard. So we paid a premium for the hype, if you will.
But experts say the Y2K scare has had a positive effect, frightening American businesses into making a first-class leap into the 21st century. Bell Industries makes computer software in Indianapolis and across the country, spending $2 million to survive the turn of the century, and as a byproduct, cut costs.
The new system has allowed us to enable our customers to place orders with us directly.
The Gartner Group, a computer research firm that consulted U.S. businesses on Y2K, says those who prepared are now more efficient, cutting their sales cost on an average of 50%, and the cost of dealing with suppliers by 70%.
In this case, instead of going Chevrolet, they went Cadillac. And that Cadillac is going to really position the whole economy well in the next couple years, and our businesses are going to be cutting-edge competitive.
Expensive Y2K solutions, experts agree, make America overprepared for the year 2000, but poised to profit from an historic push to modernize. Jim Avila, NBC News, Chicago.
Up next, as we continue here this Monday night, the first 72 hours of power for Russia's outspoken new president. We'll let you know who he is, who's in, and who's out. And later on, the ER of the future. How emergency medical care is about to take some big leaps forward for you and your family. It's our Lifeline 2000 report tonight. The celebration on Wall Street suddenly stops. The Dow dives. The worst day ever for tech stocks. Where is it going? Decision 2000, Bush versus McCain, a new plan for an early knockout. Home Alone, moving day for Hillary Clinton. Tonight, what's in the truck? And Bill Bradley's running mate, his wife. In Depth, what happened to winter? Why January just isn't what it used to be. And Lifeline 2000, important news for women preventing cervical cancer. A new test, easy, better, done at home.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw. Substituting tonight, Brian Williams.
Good evening. Well, it was enough to make you miss 1999, the first Tuesday of the year 2000, and it felt as if the bottom was falling out of Wall Street. At times today it was a free fall, nothing to hold stocks up, nowhere to go but down. The Dow fell 359.5 points, about 3% of its overall value, and closing back below 11,000. The NASDAQ took an even bigger hit, down 229.5. That's the worst one-day point drop ever on the NASDAQ. Some are calling this the Tuesday sell-off. Now, what about Wednesday? What about beyond as we go into this new year? Are investors really willing in this country to hang on for the long haul? We begin tonight at the New York Stock Exchange with CNBC's Ron Insona.
A stunning blowout on Wall Street. The Dow, S&P, and NASDAQ all tumbling. The NASDAQ suffering its biggest point drop ever. What's going on? Many investors are now worried that the Federal Reserve will raise interest rates when it meets next month, since it's clear the year 2000 computer glitch isn't slowing down the red-hot economy. That point underscored at the White House today as President Clinton recommends the reappointment of Alan Greenspan as chairman of the Federal Reserve.
This chairman's leadership has been good, not just for the American economy and the mavens of finance on Wall Street. It has been good for ordinary Americans.
What else is behind today's sell-off? Many investors who made huge gains on tech stocks last year selling today to defer taxes into next year. What about the rest of the world? Overseas markets also weak today, especially in Europe. What happens now? Investors are bracing for more selling at the opening bell tomorrow. What they're hoping for, however, is that mutual fund managers who normally begin to reinvest 401k money on the third business day of the year will start looking for bargains and help to turn the tide. Brian?
Ron Insona at the NYSE for us tonight. Thanks. They kept saying those internet stocks would have to come down sometime, and today that day arrived. Tonight, NBC's Jim Avila on whether or not high tech means high risk.
Veteran NASDAQ investor Scott Ebeling riding the high-tech wave, unfazed by today's record drop.
Not concerned at all. I expected this.
Expected because high-tech stocks have been on a roll. Many knew had to end. Analysts warning these prices are simply too high.
We have profit-taking here, plain and simple. That was yesterday and today, and it may be prolonged for a few more days.
In 1999, the NASDAQ was up more than 80%. Today's drop only down 5.6%, a small correction, and a smaller percentage drop in the previous record fall in August of 1998, an 8.6% drop.
It is a significant point drop, but in perspective, it's still way up in the last year.
In fact, look at the NASDAQ chart. Just since October, tremendous jumps. Today's fall barely dents.
For it to correct back to 3,900 right here is to be expected. It should look more like this.
The hot stocks did take a hit today, but long-range damage minimal. Case in point, Amazon.com. 2 shares bought last January for $118, worth nearly 10 times that before trading began today. Today's drop, $89, still left that $100 investor with $983 over the year. And America Online, AOL, 3 shares bought last year for $111.60, worth $996 before today's drop. Lost nearly $64 today, but still that $100 investment closed today at $932.
Hardest hit today, anyone who bought high-tech stocks in the last 2 months. Prices at their peak, now watching others cash in their profits, a move analysts expect to continue tomorrow. Jim Avila, NBC News, Chicago.
Now to another numbers battle, this time the Republican race for president and the rise of the number 2 guy. A funny thing happened to George W. Bush during his stroll to the GOP nomination, and that's John McCain, and these two men are just getting started. With us tonight from Battleground, New Hampshire, NBC's David Bloom. David, good evening to you.
Good evening, Brian. Today, Texas Governor George W. Bush began an intensive 4-week-long effort to drive Arizona Senator John McCain out of this Republican race by trying to defeat McCain in the one presidential primary he most needs to win, New Hampshire.
To introduce her to you today, Elizabeth.
Step 1 for Bush, a ringing endorsement today by former Republican rival Elizabeth Dole. Dole comparing the Texas governor to former President Ronald Reagan.
Today, we rally to another Western governor, just as bold in challenging the status quo, just as resolved to restore pride in our institutions, just as determined to be himself.
Step 2. Bush today attacks McCain's tax cuts as too meager, saying McCain's plan, quote, doesn't address the middle class, doesn't address people who live on the outskirts of poverty.
The 50th person making $50,000 and family of 4 in New Hampshire get roughly a $2,000 tax cut under my plan, $200 tax cut under Senator McCain's plan.
Nonsense, says McCain, who, taking a page out of Bill Clinton's playbook, accuses Bush of tilting his tax cuts to the wealthy. Boarding his campaign bus dubbed the Straight Talk Express, McCain, echoing Democrats, says the projected federal budget surplus should be used not to cut taxes, but to shore up Social Security and Medicare.
The reality is that Governor Bush wants to take all of the surplus and use it for tax cuts. I want the surplus put into Social Security. That family making $50,000 a year wants to be sure that their Social Security is going to be there and it's solvent.
McCain dismissed Dole's endorsement, but tonight Dole, popular especially with Republican women, has joined forces with Bush. Perhaps with one eye on the vice presidency, but with another eye on trying to knock McCain out of the race before his surging candidacy gains a foothold outside of New Hampshire. Brian?
David Bloom in New Hampshire for us tonight. NBC News in depth tonight. Extreme weather just a few days into this new year, and already the effects of that old weather phenomenon, La Nina, are kicking in with record temperatures being set in cities around the country. Highs were hit yesterday in Columbus, Georgia, Baltimore, Maryland, Newark, New Jersey, just to name a few of them. It is all part of an odd system making for some strange weather. NBC's Robert Hager reports tonight on this 21st century warm-up in depth.
Millennium Island in the Pacific, first to greet the dawn of the new century. Looks like a coral paradise. But with wild weather patterns around the world, in 40 years, scientists say global warming may raise the level of the sea and erase this island from the map.
What we think we're beginning to see now and over the next century is a climate change more rapid than anything we've seen in the last 10,000 years, certainly, and one of the most rapid changes that we think has ever occurred in the past.
Not just in the Pacific. Temperatures in the eastern U.S. since the first of this year, 15 to 20 degrees above normal. New Yorkers without coats today, spring weather in what's supposed to be the worst month of winter.
You just wake up in the middle of January and you just go, where's the snow?
Spring-like tornadoes hitting during winter as well. Twisters overnight in Owensboro, Kentucky, and other southeastern states. 13 injured. Today, officials count nearly 800 buildings damaged. Residents shaken.
It was just a powerful storm, and you really can't explain it.
Hard, too, to explain the lack of snow in California's Sierra Nevada mountains. When they measured today, it was less than a quarter of normal, second driest ever measured.
Time was when scientists wondered if such events were simply normal cycles of warming and cooling. And in fact, much of the nation will turn colder the next few days. But the statistics point to a trend. Last decade, warmest ever in the United States. 1998, warmest year ever. 1999, second warmest. And what's ahead? The National Weather Service's Jim Laver.
Warmer across a large portion of the country, the eastern third, the southern half or so.
Here's how it looks on the official map now through March. Warmer than normal from Southern California, across the southwest to the southeast, and up to New England.
And drier in the southeast, Florida, Georgia, and Texas, New Mexico, those areas.
And it's not just the U.S. that's warmer. A new international study finds ice melting in the Arctic, melting at an average of 14,000 square miles a year, an area larger than a lot of states in the U.S. Raises sea level and threatens treasures like Millennium Island. First in the world to celebrate the coming of the next 1,000 years. But as one dramatic consequence of the warming that affects us all, the land beneath these celebrants' feet may be swallowed by the sea less than a half century from now. Robert Hager, NBC News, Washington.